At 3 in the morning, when most of the world was asleep, a single phone call rewrote the balance of power. The voice on the other end was not a diplomat or an aide. It was Vladimir Putin himself. And the man he called was not a veteran of the Cold War, not a general backed by nuclear firepower, but a 35-year-old African revolutionary, Ibrahim Traoré. That call, lasting just 47 minutes, carried the weight of centuries. For in that conversation, Africa did not ask for permission. It did not beg for aid. It declared sovereignty. Why did the Kremlin tremble at a voice from Ouagadougou? Why did the master of global strategy speak in the language of another land? Not to instruct, but to learn. The answer lies not only in Burkina Faso's defiance, but in a model of unity that no empire had prepared for. What began as a call in the night became a revelation that would ripple across continents. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear is not just a headline, it is a hinge of history. Subscribe and stand with us. 6 months before that midnight phone call, a tremor ran through West Africa. It was not the blast of artillery, nor the marching of foreign troops, but something far more profound. In a single stroke, 3 nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, expelled foreign military bases that had stood on their soil for decades. For 60 years, the continent had been carved and recarved into zones of influence. But in that moment, the map shifted. Without waiting for permission from Paris, Washington, or Moscow, these countries declared a new path, a regional defense alliance built by Africans, for Africans. What made this act extraordinary was not only what was removed, but what was not invited back. For decades, the old pattern had been predictable. When French forces departed, Russian advisors would arrive. When one superpower left, another would take its place. But this time, the script was torn apart. Instead of substituting Western dependency for Eastern dependency, the Sahel leaders crafted something different. They built what they called genuine sovereignty, an alliance without strings, an army without foreign masters, a road paved with African hands. Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré's command, became the symbol of this new defiance. The world had always seen the landlocked nation as fragile, too small, too poor, too vulnerable to stand alone. Yet within its borders, a bold decision was brewing. For decades, Africa had exported raw gold at $60 a gram, only to buy it back, refined abroad, for $200 a gram. The difference, $140, was not just profit, it was the price of dependency. Year after year, that gap was siphoned from African soil into foreign vaults. Then came the announcement that shook financial markets from Johannesburg to Geneva. Burkina Faso would no longer send its gold away. Instead, it would build its own refineries, process its own wealth, and keep the value within its own borders. This was not just an economic reform. It was a revolution, carved in stone and fire. But the true shock was still to come. When the Kremlin first heard of this plan, they assumed the technology would come from Moscow. After all, Russia had spent 20 years offering weapons, engineers, and contracts to African governments. That was the strategy. Wait for frustration with the West, then step in with Russian solutions. Yet, in Ouagadougou, the phone lines told a different story. Traoré's government did not call Moscow. They did not call Beijing. They did not call Paris. Instead, they reached across the Atlantic to African-American engineers and investors, men and women whose ancestors had been scattered by the slave trade, now returning not as exiles, but as partners. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a software engineer from Atlanta, designed telecommunication systems that proved more secure than Russian networks. Dr. Kwesa Williams, a renewable energy specialist from Chicago, helped achieve levels of energy independence that Russian provinces themselves struggled to reach. Dr. Michael Thompson, a surgeon, built medical training programs that drew students away from Moscow and into West Africa's universities. This was the element no intelligence analyst had predicted. The diaspora was not sending remittances or charity. They were sending expertise, capital, and above all, a sense of belonging. For the first time in living memory, the African continent was no longer merely extracting and exporting, but building and owning. The Kremlin's Africa strategy, crafted patiently over 2 decades, was suddenly outdated. Every morning, for 3 months, Russian intelligence briefed President Putin on this quiet transformation. The reports were filled with contradictions. How could a landlocked state with limited resources establish regional alliances without collapse? How could it expel foreign influence without plunging into chaos? How could it attract investment without ceding control? Again and again, the answer came back to the same unexpected source: African Americans, returning not as outsiders, but as family. By the time the gold refineries fired their first furnaces, Moscow's Africa desk had begun to panic. One analyst wrote a line that would echo through the Kremlin halls: "If this African-American alliance succeeds, Russia will lose Africa without a single shot fired." That single sentence explains why, at 3:17 in the morning, Vladimir Putin picked up his phone. For the first time, the man who had stared down NATO, who had wielded gas pipelines like weapons, who had dictated the tempo of wars in Syria and Ukraine, felt compelled to call a young captain from West Africa. And yet, the real trigger was not the gold, not the bases, not even the alliance. It was something far deeper, a seed planted in African soil that refused to follow the old patterns. But what truly forced Putin to pick up the phone at 3 a.m. was not gold, nor alliances. It was something far more revolutionary. The Kremlin is not easily shaken. For decades, it has watched coups, wars, and revolutions unfold across Africa without losing its grip on influence. Yet one call at 3 in the morning revealed a shift so profound that even Vladimir Putin's voice carried a tremor. When Ibrahim Traoré answered his secure satellite phone, he expected a diplomat, perhaps a Russian envoy. Instead, it was the president of the Russian Federation himself, speaking in flawless French. That alone was unusual. Putin rarely abandons Russian in matters of state. But this was no ordinary conversation. "President Traoré," he began, his voice careful, almost respectful, "I have been following your remarkable achievements with great interest. Russia has extensive experience in resisting Western interference. Perhaps our experience could accelerate your success." It was the offer Moscow had extended to African leaders for 20 years. Protection in exchange for alignment, weapons in exchange for influence, Russian presence in exchange for African sovereignty. Many before had accepted, but Traoré's reply was different. "Mr. Putin," he said evenly, "with respect, Russia has been in Africa for 2 decades. You are still struggling with France and America. We have been truly independent for only 18 months. And we are already achieving results your experts said were impossible. Perhaps you should be asking what Russia can learn from Africa." Then came the silence. Not the brief pause of translation, not the hesitation of strategy, a silence that lasted 37 seconds, long enough for Traoré to count each one. When Putin finally spoke again, the tone had changed. The patronizing weight of a superpower was gone. In its place came something unexpected: curiosity. "President Traoré," he asked slowly. What exactly are you building in Africa? That question marked the turning point. For the next 20 minutes, Traore explained what no African leader had dared articulate to a global power. Africa was not exchanging dependency for dependency. It was constructing something new. He described secure telecommunications more advanced than Chinese models, renewable energy more efficient than Russian grids, and medical programs that combined African traditions with cutting-edge innovation. The key was partnership with African Americans, people who understood both advanced technology and African conditions, and who were returning not as patrons, but as family. Putin listened. The man, who had prided himself on deciphering NATO's every move, was being briefed on a reality his intelligence services had missed. His questions grew sharper, more revealing. Did African Americans expect something in return? Were they seeking influence, leverage, control? No, Traore replied. They expect to be welcomed home. They expect to be part of an African renaissance that honors our shared heritage while embracing our global potential. They expect to help build the Africa our ancestors dreamed of before colonialism scattered our people. Another silence. Then Putin admitted what no analyst in Moscow had put into words. Russia's entire Africa strategy rested on the assumption that African states would always need external support. But if Africans, united with their diaspora, could succeed alone, then every foundation of Russian influence crumbled. At that moment, the conversation ceased to be about Burkina Faso alone. It became a mirror reflecting the fragility of every empire. If Africa could rise without dependency, why not Latin America? Why not Asia's forgotten nations? Why not the Russian diaspora itself? The high point came when Putin asked a question no one expected. Is what you are building with African Americans a model that could be replicated elsewhere? He was not just worried about losing Africa. He was worried about losing the world. For Traore, this was the clearest proof yet that Africa's revolution had pierced the armor of global geopolitics. The Kremlin, which had defined itself as the counterweight to the West, was confronting a deeper truth. The real counterweight to external dominance was not another empire. It was internal unity. That realization carried both awe and fear. Awe, because Putin recognized the authenticity of what was happening. Fear, because he knew it could not be contained. And then Putin asked the question that revealed why he had really called. The echoes of that midnight call were not confined to Moscow's gilded halls. They reverberated through Ouagadougou's crowded streets, through Mali's dusty markets, through Niger's villages where families still bore the scars of foreign occupation. For the first time in living memory, ordinary citizens felt the weight of history tilt in their favor. Inside Burkina Faso, change was not abstract. It was tangible. Farmers who once sold raw cocoa, cotton, and gold to foreign buyers began hearing a new phrase on national radio: value addition. School children learned that their nation would no longer export its wealth unfinished, but refine it, process it, transform it on their own soil. Traders in Ouagadougou whispered about the gold refineries rising near the capital, monuments not of dependency but of dignity. At universities, the effect was equally profound. The partnership with African American professionals did not stop at engineering projects. It opened new horizons in education. When Dr. Michael Thompson launched medical training programs, students flocked not to Moscow or Paris, but to campuses in Burkina Faso. For the first time, young Africans were proud to study at home, to build their futures on African soil, rather than in foreign lecture halls. In villages, renewable energy grids designed by Dr. Quesa Williams flickered to life. Communities once resigned to darkness celebrated the arrival of electricity not supplied by Western aid, not rented from Chinese conglomerates, but generated and maintained by African engineers. A new phrase began circulating: our hands, our light. The social fabric tightened. Instead of migration as the only dream, staying became an option. Young men and women saw proof that their future could be written in their own language, on their own land. What was once resignation transformed into pride. Politically, the ripple effect was even sharper. By expelling foreign bases and proving that security could be maintained through regional cooperation, Burkina Faso and its allies shattered a myth repeated for generations, that African states could not guarantee their own stability without outside armies. The new Regional Defense Pact was not just symbolic. Patrols along borders became more coordinated. Intelligence sharing grew sharper. Communities that once felt abandoned by both African governments and foreign forces now witnessed their own soldiers standing guard with renewed confidence. The opposition within Burkina Faso found itself cornered. For years, critics accused leaders of recklessness, of alienating traditional partners. Yet the results: stable borders, rising gold revenues, expanding education, silenced those voices. In place of skepticism came an uneasy recognition. The young captain was building not chaos, but a foundation for something larger. This is why many began to speak of Ibrahim Traoré legacy. His leadership was not measured merely in months of office, but in the permanence of what was unfolding. Roads could crumble, contracts could expire, but the principle that Africans could achieve sovereignty by uniting with their diaspora was irreversible. That was the true inheritance. Yet every transformation carried its dangers. Sanctions loomed. Western diplomats whispered of isolation and punishment. Regional elites tied to foreign capitals plotted in shadows. But for the first time, these threats seemed less menacing, because in markets and universities, in hospitals and power stations, ordinary citizens saw progress with their own eyes. The political class across Africa watched closely. Leaders in Ghana, Senegal, and even South Africa debated whether to adopt similar measures. Could they, too, process their own minerals? Could they, too, build alliances that were not dependent on external patrons? For some, the idea was frightening. For others, it was liberating. International observers spoke of instability, of unpredictability. But inside West Africa, people spoke of a renaissance. Pride replaced pity. The soil that had long been drained of wealth began to feel fertile again, not only with crops, but with confidence. Still, the most important question lingered. Was this transformation sustainable? Could a small, landlocked nation hold its ground against pressures from every direction? Could the fragile alliances of the Sahel withstand the storms to come? But the tremors of this revolution were not confined to Ouagadougou. They shook every capital from Washington to Beijing. When news of the midnight call reached the world's capitals, reactions unfolded with both alarm and intrigue. Moscow was the first to act. 3 days after speaking with Traore, Putin convened an emergency meeting with his Africa advisors. For 2 decades, the Russian playbook had been consistent: offer military bases, supply weapons, secure mineral concessions. But in that meeting, the president stunned his inner circle. He declared that Russia's assumptions about Africa were no longer valid. If Moscow continued treating the continent as a dependent partner, Russia itself would become irrelevant. The consequences came swiftly. 2 weeks later, the Kremlin announced a new approach: partnerships in technology and education rather than extraction and military presence. For the first time, Russia publicly acknowledged African decision-making authority. It was not charity, it was survival. In Beijing, policymakers were no less unsettled. For years, China had invested billions in infrastructure, ports, and railways across the continent, yet influence remained elusive. Now they observed African-American partnerships delivering greater trust with far less money. The Chinese press began quietly studying the model, questioning whether cultural connection was more powerful than financial scale. Europe faced a harsher mirror. Centuries of colonial history had long been Europe's claim to influence. Yet in this new era, those ties mattered less than bonds of family. When African Americans returned to work hand in hand with continental Africans, the symbolism was stronger than treaties or trade deals. European leaders, especially in Paris, feared that their historical leverage was dissolving into irrelevance. In Washington, the reaction was divided. Policymakers understood that the United States had stumbled upon an unexpected advantage. Its own African American citizens were becoming bridges to Africa. Yet this also threatened the traditional model of American power. For if African Americans found dignity and influence through partnership with Africa, they would no longer measure success solely by inclusion in U.S. systems. Instead, they would bring the strength of America to Africa itself. For Washington strategists, this was both an opportunity and a challenge. Global institutions, from the African Union to ECOWAS, found themselves caught between caution and admiration. They feared instability, yet could not ignore the results. Stronger alliances, rising revenues, and a vision that inspired ordinary citizens across the continent. This vision soon acquired a name. Observers began to speak of Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a horizon where Africa stood not as a dependency, but as a sovereign power bloc, connected by its diaspora, fueled by its own resources, governed by its own priorities. It was not a distant dream. It was a roadmap already in motion. And so, the world began to wonder, if Africa could change the game, what stops others from doing the same? The final question Putin asked still lingers in the air. What are you going to do next? For Ibrahim Traoré, the answer was never about one country alone. It was about a continent. Over the next 2 years, Burkina Faso's government announced its intention to expand the African American alliance to 30 nations. This was not diplomacy as usual. It was not an organization of signatures on paper. It was a movement of engineers, doctors, investors, and teachers building brick by brick, lab by lab, classroom by classroom. Universities became the next frontier. Plans were unveiled for African institutions capable of attracting global talent, not because they mirrored Western models, but because they blended advanced science with authentic cultural traditions. A curriculum that paired cutting-edge innovation with African healing, storytelling, and environmental wisdom promised something unique, an education rooted in both heritage and future. On the economic front, new companies emerged, not subsidiaries of foreign corporations, but African firms competing globally with products designed for African realities and global markets alike. Renewable energy, grids, medical technology, secure digital systems. Each innovation chipped away at the myth of dependency. Investors who once ignored Africa began to take notice, not because of charity, but because of undeniable performance. Politically, the path ahead is filled with risk. Sanctions remain a looming weapon. Sabotage and disinformation are already being deployed. Yet the unity of the Sahel Alliance has shown resilience. By strengthening border patrols, sharing intelligence, and building common defense strategies, they are rewriting the rules of regional security. Most importantly, the sense of identity is changing. Across the continent, young Africans speak of renaissance rather than resignation. Across the Atlantic, African Americans speak of homecoming rather than exile. This merging of dreams, separated by oceans and centuries, is forging a new reality. For the world, the implications are immense. If 30 nations truly unite with 50 million African Americans, backed by 1.6 trillion in economic power, then the balance of power shifts irreversibly. No empire can dictate terms to a family that chooses to stand together. The future is not guaranteed. It is fragile, contested, unfinished, but it is within reach. The road ahead is long, filled with obstacles, yet lit by a vision that cannot be extinguished. And yet, one question remains. How fast can Africa become too strong to divide, too authentic to copy? When history looks back at the early decades of the 21st century, it may not remember every summit, every treaty, every battlefield, but it will remember a single phone call in the dead of night. When a man in Moscow asked a man in Ouagadougou what the future of Africa would be, for Ibrahim Traoré, that call was not about prestige. It was about proof that Africa no longer had to choose between West and East. Proof that sovereignty was not a slogan, but a living practice. Proof that when a continent works hand in hand with its diaspora, the impossible becomes achievable. This is the beginning of Ibrahim Traoré legacy. It is not a monument carved in stone, but a movement carried in hearts. A legacy measured not in speeches, but in gold refineries, in solar grids, in universities where African students stand tall. Twice in a single lifetime, Traoré may be remembered. Once as the captain who defied empires, and again as the leader who built the foundations of an independent Africa. But the vision extends beyond today. It is Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a horizon where Africa defines its own future, where sovereignty is not negotiated but assumed, where partnerships are chosen on the basis of dignity, not dependency. It is a vision of 30 nations, 50 million African Americans, and 1.3 billion Africans building a common destiny. The world may doubt, resist, or even conspire, but the seed has already been planted. And when Africa chooses to cultivate it, the harvest will be unstoppable. So we end where we began, with a question. If a small, landlocked nation could force the Kremlin to reconsider its place in the world, what could an entire continent achieve when it rises as one? Stay with us, share this story, and add your voice, because the legacy is already being written, and the vision belongs not just to one leader, but to all who believe in Africa's future.